France has been the world's second power for a long time. After the Charlemagne Empire, Paris always found itself on the back foot against the Arabs, the Italians, the Spanish, the English, the Germans, the Americans. When America created a global system, freezing geopolitics in place, France could only be a cog in the machine. The French kept most of their production in-house, protecting their domestic market. Their economy barely even Europeanized. The French military maintains a strong capacity for independent action. With the order's end, history thaws. Without the global order, the French economic model will still work. Paris maintains reasonably good working relationships with the Americans, the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Italians, the Germans, even the Russians. Their position is why most European treaties are signed in Paris. France is emerging as the only significant European power with a sustainable domestic system and no strategic entanglements, leaving it free to shape Europe in its own image and perhaps in lands beyond. France is a power due to a specific region, the Beauce. The Beauce's limestone-rich soils place it among the world's most fertile agricultural regions, and its surpluses have proven sufficient to feed all of northern France for centuries. The river Yonne cuts south to north through the Beauce's eastern half, bringing all the normal benefits of cheap transport to high-quality agricultural lands that are the recipe for success throughout the world. But the Yonne is no standard river. Some 67 miles downstream of the head of navigation at Auxerre, the Yonne empties into the Seine system just above the Paris metropolitan region. The Seine system web works about 280 miles of river frontage in France's northern lobe, connecting the Beauce's bounty to several population cores, including the capital. The Seine then drains into the English Channel, making France part of the hustle and bustle of the northern European plain. The plain is home to not just the French, but also the Belgians, Dutch, Germans, Danes, Poles, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, and Belarusians before it merges seamlessly into the great wide opens of the Eurasian hordelands, home of the Ukrainians, Russians, Kazakhs, and more. Nowhere in the world are so many different ethnicities with their own countries crammed into a single geographic feature. Paris's location along the Seine near the far western end of the NEP guarantees the French a seat at any European table. Undeniably, it is the Beauce-Seine connection that makes France a quintessential northern European power, complete with all the wealth and capacity that appertain thereto. But as central to the French identity as Paris and the Seine are, they are not enough. Luckily, the French have more, much more. Just as the Seine makes France a power of northern Europe, the Rhone makes France a power of southern Europe. But unlike the busyness of northern Europe, there simply isn't very much competition down south. The Mediterranean basin's extreme aridity limits civilizational options. There are few places where the land rises sharply enough to wring some rain out of the dry air. Those locations bloom as a result, but that same sharp rise prevents local rivers from having the calm flatness required for navigability, and from that, national potency. France is the only power with Mediterranean frontage that's an exception. Undeniably, it is the Beauce-Rhone connection that makes France a quintessential Mediterranean power, complete with all the wealth and capacity that comes with that stature. Tickling the Beauce's southern edges flows yet another river, the Loire, the River of Kings. In many ways, the Loire Basin serves as France's window out of the Old World, enabling it to be a player on a far larger stage than merely Europe. And these aren't even all of France's rivers. The Meuse enables the French to dominate much of Belgium. The Moselle is a tributary of a border river, the Rhine, that enables French influence into both Germany and the Netherlands. Follow the Rhone upriver, and one ends up in Switzerland, giving the French a clear path to the heart of Europe's supposedly neutral power. The Garonne is navigable all the way upstream to Toulouse, a mere 100 miles from the Mediterranean coast, increasing French influence over countries south, while also creating a river and road shortcut that negates the need for the long sail around Iberia. Even the arrangement of France's rivers encourages her onward. The navigable flows of the Seine and Loire are close enough together to cradle all of northwest France. Perhaps a better verb would be smother. Somewhat rugged regions like Normandy and Brittany would normally be too remote from the river zones to be assimilated easily and thus be likely to turn rebellious. Even the shape of France, in essence a knob near the end of the European peninsula, helps. France's frontage on the English Channel, Bay of Biscay, and the Mediterranean gives it a mild marine climate, far more typical of an island. Compared with the bulk of Europe, France is warmer and wetter, while also experiencing less extreme seasonal variations. With the exception of the highlands of the massive central, all of France is firmly temperate. France even has pretty good borders. On France's southern and southeastern borders jut the Pyrenees and Alps, both replete with peaks so sharp they have permitted little direct land contact with the Iberian and Apennine peninsulas throughout recorded history. Even France's borders on the invasion-happy corridor of the northern European plain are somewhat circumscribed. To France's northeast, a series of densely forested foothills push from the Alps nearly to the North Sea coast, making this Belgian gap the northern European plain's narrowest point. France's many rivers distribute the Beauce's bounty far and wide. They serve as arteries for commercial interests. They entrench the French national identity. They encourage power projection in three wildly different directions into three wildly different regions: the Channel and North Sea, the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and the Bay of Biscay and the New World. They shelter France in the most defensible position possible on the northern European plain while still enabling the French to take advantage of all the opportunities the plain can provide. And as geography doesn't change, those opportunities have existed for a long time. The French have arguably the longest tradition of operating as a cohesive culture vis-à-vis their location of any people on Earth. France's unique mix of geographies does more than make it special. The configuration of French lands makes it culturally sophisticated, economically aware, technologically advanced, politically robust, and diplomatically essential. It makes France rich, whether in the sleepy countryside or the city of light. It makes France involved in places as close as Bern and Brussels and as far away as Montreal and Saigon. It grants the French a deep understanding of how the pieces fit together and what levers need to be pulled to achieve this or that result. It makes France a superpower, and a durable one at that. In short, the place was ready to blow. Think of the virus of American democracy upon this system as less the systemic disruptor and more the proverbial straw. It got pretty ugly. The French Revolution didn't simply behead the royal family. Its subsequent terror introduced Western civilization to populism of the ugliest sort, mobs large and small literally burning down the ancien regime, complete with impromptu execution tribunals so prolific that there were occasional basket shortages because so many heads needed to be caught. Things like this happen when ossified cultural, military, and economic norms melt away in a few short months. What emerged from the detritus in the French terror's aftermath, however, wasn't simply a reborn France, but something fundamentally new: nationalist France. From a geopolitical point of view, nationalism's defining characteristic is its capacity to better harness national power. Medieval feudalism splits capacity among the royals, the nobles, and the peasantry, with loyalty within and among the three largely determined by a system of bribes and threats. It works, but is wildly inefficient. In contrast, nationalism fuses ethnic identity directly to a centralized governing system, both eliminating the middleman and making loyalty part of the governing rationale. Such organizational slimming funnels more resources, financial and labor, in particular to the one government that rules it all. Nationalism took root quickly, in no small part because France's rivers enabled the quick transmission of ideas. A single horrific bloodbath to annihilate the economic and political classes of the medieval order in France was off to the races. The question quickly became what to do with all those newly concentrated resources. Nationalism suggests the answer. Because the nation-state is rooted in ethnicity, not everyone qualifies as people. Sitting not so comfortably on the other side of the 20th century, you probably see where this is going.
You've got three main types. You've got your 10 nanometer and smaller. Those are your super advanced ones. Those are used in most AI programs. So that would include things like satellites. That would include things like self-driving. At the bottom, you've got your 90 nanometers and bigger. And these are almost analog chips. They can only do like one or two things. So like the chip that's in your smart bulbs would be one of those. And then in the middle, 90 to 10, everything else, that's the vast bulk of the market. And that's everything from aerospace to automotive to power regulation. And if a single country falls out of that constellation, none of it works because there is no backup for any of it.
Okay.
So if we do have a war in Taiwan that is meaningful in any way, we lose the good chips. And that means AI goes into a winter for at least a decade. The 90 and bigger, the dumb chips, those are almost exclusively China.
Okay.
So when China goes, no matter how China goes, we lose the Internet of Things and everything that comes from that.
Huh.
Everything in the middle is actually significantly more durable. The chips aren't as advanced. Their production comes from different places. There's some in Europe, there's some in Japan, there's some in South Korea, there's a lot in the United States. In fact, by value, the United States By value, the United States produces more chips than the rest of the world put together. Those were 10 nanometer and higher. Those are really expensive chips, but there's just not a lot of them. And the 90 nanometer and below, there's a lot of them, but they're just not very expensive. So everything in the middle for your cars, for your planes, and so on, we're probably okay with a China meltdown or even a Taiwanese capture or destruction. That doesn't mean it's immune to all the shocks that are going on out there. There's a lot, especially with the Ukraine war, I'm concerned about. But we're not really worried about the infrastructure or the industrial plant. And, in this world, that's about as good as the news gets. We're going to be really good. I mean, we're pretty good now. We're already the world's largest economy, highest standard of living, energy secure, food secure, blah, 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 blah. 10 years from now, once we've built out the industrial plant to replace a lot of these places like China that are falling away, we're also going to have lower costs of production and more secure production and higher employment. And the employment here will be fueling the factories that are selling the products to the people who are consuming here, and will be broadly immune to international shocks. This is a good story. But the path from here to there, there are a lot of bumps, and it is not great. Sure. So let's deal with it first from the strategic point of view, and then we can deal with it from the economic point of view. So one of the things that the Europeans refused to admit is after the American Civil War with Reconstruction, while the United States was kind of off by its own, it was digesting a continent. And over the course of Reconstruction and knitting the country back together and conquering the West, we became not just the largest economy in the world. We were that before the Civil War. We became a larger economy than the British Empire, the French Empire, and the German Empire combined. And so when World War II came around, if you're willing to step back and ignore the emotion and just look at the numbers, there was no way that the war was going to win in any way other than American domination. And so once we got to 1944, and it was clear that the Soviets had broken the back of the Germans in the East, and that the Normandy and the Italian invasions were going to be successful, everyone realized it was time to prepare for what's next. And for most of the Europeans, they thought what's next was going to be an American empire that occupied Western Europe. And they were in the process of making their peace with that because they realized they didn't have much of an option. Because if you were like Dane or Dutch, you were in exile. And so the deals that you cut when the Americans invited you to discuss the post-war system were going to determine the nature of your occupation. And in the opening speech, the United States made it very clear that was not what was up. We were going to create a fundamentally different system with the goal of making global war unthinkable. So in the world before World War II, it was imperial. Everyone had their own navy, everyone patrolled their own supply lines, everybody guarded them jealously, and everybody fought over the supply lines and the market access and the colonies. The American vision for the post-war environment would be that the U.S., which had a huge navy at that time, would patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and access any commodity and trade with any partner. And the real kicker was that the Americans would open their market first because there wasn't a European market in the aftermath of the war. All you had to do was let us write your security policies because we saw the world differently. It wasn't about economics for us. It was about security. We saw the Stalin-esque Soviet war machine rampaging through the East. We were getting reports from our intelligence that what the Soviets were doing in Ukraine and eventually in Poland was worse than what the Nazis had done in many ways, which was, mind-boggling. And we realized that there was no way that we operating from a different continent could fight that unless we had literally millions of bodies between us and the Red Army. And since the Europeans were coming out of the most destructive war in human history, they were in no position to do anything unless they could be properly incentivized. So the whole idea of globalization from the American point of view was to give the entire world an economic reason to stand up to Stalin. And it worked, because it used to be, well, globalization meant you didn't need all four. You just needed one. And you could trade for the others under American protection. And that literally created the world that we knew. From the American point of view, we think of this as containment, and it was. From the rest of the world's point of view, it was everyone getting on the road to civilization more or less at the same time. From different starting points, going at different speeds, but for the first time in history, we were all industrializing. And that changed everything. And that creates the environment that we're in today. They were invited, but when it became clear that it wasn't about Stalinist central control, their delegation broke down and left fairly shortly thereafter. A lot of the what we consider the Central European countries were there and did sign, but then they became Soviet bloc satellites and obviously didn't participate in the deals that happened on the backside. Think about the time difference between now and then. So, we are roughly 80 years from World War II now, roughly 70 years from the Korean War. Think about what was 70 and 80 years before World War II. You had all of the Franco-German wars. You had the rise of Imperial Germany. And so people knew in their bones that when a large country captured another country, it was theirs.
Yeah.
And this went a very different direction. The Brits came in with a plan for taking over the world again that the Americans were going to pay for.
Oh, no kidding.
So everyone had their preconceived notions. The Brits were just, wacko on that point. But, everyone's parents are a little odd when they get older.
Interesting.
But for everybody else, the question was, what are the American terms going to be? Because, why would they bring us to a off-season ski resort in the middle of nowhere if it wasn't just to grind into us just how little? One of the things with the Ukraine war now is we're discovering, and everyone discovered this in World War II and in World War I and in every war the Russians have ever been in. Year one is a disaster. And then in year two, the Russians mobilize and start throwing bodies at the problem. And by the time we got to Stalingrad, there were a lot of bodies being thrown. And in the assault going both east and especially west into Germany, the Russians were regularly suffering 4-to-1 casualty ratios, but they just kept coming. And when we realized that was going to be the nature of the fight post-Germany, the only way you stop the bodies in that number is with even more bodies. And since there were as many Soviets as there were Europeans, we needed everyone. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's Russia, so data, who knows? But our best guess is that by the time we get to May, the Ukrainians will have brought in 60,000 fresh troops that have trained with NATO with new gear that will make it the toughest fighting force in Europe aside from the United States itself. And arguably, considering our force posture in Europe, maybe even tougher. But the Russians will have another 500,000 men in theater. And so you're talking about 600,000 to 700,000 Russians on the front compared to the 100,000 that they started with. So we're about to start the second chapter. This is a fundamentally different conflict now. Yeah, there's pros and cons if you're not Russian. I mean, if you're Russian, the numbers are pretty obvious. The cons is, that's a lot of people. And Ukraine can only win this if it's a battle of movement where they can inflict 8-to-1 casualty ratios. And we've had a muddy winter. It hasn't gotten cold enough to freeze the ground. They haven't been able to move over with their tanks at all. And so they've been stuck in these head-to-head battles in places like Bakhmut, where they're suffering casualties they can't afford. And in a battle where the Ukrainians kill 3 times as many Russians as they lose, that's a battle the Ukrainians lost. They need to get this up to at least 8-to-1 to have a chance. On the other side, by the end of this year, the Russians will have committed at least 100,000 men. We're already approaching 200,000 casualties, which probably means approaching 200,000 deaths because Russian battlefield triage and medical is atrocious. 1 million men have fled. There are 8 million men in their 20s in Russia. So 1 million is gone, not coming back. The other million is getting chopped up. That still leaves them 6 million to go, but this is Russia's last generation. So even if the Russians do manage to overwhelm Ukraine this year and start what will turn into the greatest genocide since World War II, This is going to take a lot of men, and this is the last conventional war that the Russians will be capable of fighting.
It doesn't matter who's president. The government is always going to do a degree of spin to help people, or to try to get people to not panic. I think to the degree that the governments of the world understand the problem is in some question in my mind. But the biggest concern that I have is we are radically unprepared for China exiting the manufacturing business. Demographically speaking, their labor costs have gone up now by a factor of 16 since 2020. They're no longer the low-cost producer of anything. And the demographic situation is now so atrocious that they're literally running out of people aged 40 to be in the factories in the first place. And that's before you consider perhaps an energy shock because of the Ukraine war, or trade shock because of tensions with the United States. We're going to lose them. And we are not ready for that. Well, central bank digital currencies mean something different to everyone. And in the most extreme version, which is what the Chinese are trying to implement, but some version of what you just outlined actually is the express government goal. The ability to monitor in real time every transaction everywhere. But keep in mind the very big difference between the American system and the Chinese system. The American Federal Reserve is just a few hundred people, and they have no interest in monitoring transactions, and they have no capacity without at least 100-fold expansion in their staff. China has 1.3 billion people, and government control of everyone's daily life is the first and foremost goal of the Chinese Communist Party. So for one of these governments, a digital currency is expressly designed to do exactly what you said, and in the other case, with the Federal Reserve isn't even sure it wants one. The Federal Reserve is poking at it, but it doesn't at the moment see a very strong use case for an independent digital currency. Now, if you talk about a digital currency as what the Fed is actually doing, which is just basically making all transactions that want to be digital, and you use paper to cash as rarely as possible, and everything is cleared on your phone, then yes, the Federal Reserve is going that direction, but the United Kingdom is already there because the United Kingdom basically got rid of paper checks. So there's a natural evolution here in the financial system that the Fed is embracing. But what most people talk about when they're talking about CDBs is really not what the Western world is even exploring, much less has an interest in. This is weird. So I'm not a big fan of the Biden administration's economic policies writ large, but this is one where I think at least they've got the spirit right, even if they've got some of the details wrong. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a dumb name for what it actually does, seeks to build out processing capacity for a lot of the technologies and especially a lot of the base materials that are required in order to do the green transition. Now, I'm a green, but I'm a green that tends to get uninvited to parties because I can actually do math, and I call people when they're saying bullshit. In the case of what's going on with the Biden administration, though, we are the sunniest first world country after Australia, and we are the windiest first world country. So there is a lot of room in the United States in an economically viable manner to expand our green tech footprint and splice it in with everything else we do. Now, there's 1,000 caveats in that statement about the wheres and the whens and the hows and the how fasts, but I think that's a good starting point. The weak point in the American green tech industry is we produce almost none of the base materials and even less of the processed materials. So once the lithium is basically mined and concentrated, it then needs to be turned into lithium metal. That processing step from the powder to the metal, none of that's done here. Very little of the copper harnesses are done. Almost no of the nickel processing is done here, and on and on and on and on. And if I'm right about China, we're going to lose the location that does most of the processing. And guess what the country is in the world that does the second most processing? Russia. So the idea that there's a few $100 billion floating around in the American system to chase after industry to do this at scale in North America, I think is a grand idea. Once you get out of the weeds, you will find things you don't like. But overall, remember, this is the first industrial policy the United States has had since the 1940s. The advantage we have on the American president right now is that he was a full grown-ass man in the 1940s. He remembers how that went. He's the only person alive right now who does. And so it makes sense that he's the first person to come up with an industrial policy since then. Well, let me give you four. The first one, and by far the most significant, is the demographic collapse. As countries industrialize, they move into the cities and birth rate drops. And the same time that happened in China, starting in the late 1970s, the Chinese also instituted the one-child policy. So you had economic trends crashing the birth rate at the same time as the government forced it down even further. And now in major cities across China, the number of births per woman is below 0.8, which is a historical low for any country in any era. And we're looking at a complete loss of the working class in China in under a decade. And there's not an economic model that works with that at all. So that's number one. There's no negotiating on that one. You can't fix that. Second big problem is that Chairman Xi has executed or exiled or imprisoned everyone within the PRC who's capable of independent thought, and no one wants to bring him information anymore. So if you were going to attempt to have a more dynamic system that thinks forward, thinks ahead, they don't have that anymore. They may have had it at one point, we can debate that, but it's gone now. And you basically have one guy making policy in a box and everyone afraid to tell him anything because they don't want to be the next messenger that's shot. That's not a great thing to do when your country is facing critical problems. Number three, the financial sector. When the United States got into trouble in 2008 with subprime, we had doubled total private credit in 8 years. That was too much too fast. China has increased their credit by a factor of 34 in 20 years. There is no country in history that has gone up this far, this fast, ever, and survived doing 1/3 of that volume. So you want to talk about a financial crisis, it will be centered in the People's Republic, and the economic sector that is most exposed in China is agriculture. So not only do you have an industrial bust to go with the financial bust, you might even have famine. And that brings us to the fourth thing. China imports 3/4 of their energy. 3/4 of that comes from the Persian Gulf or further beyond. And they import over 3/4 of the inputs that are required for them to grow their own food. They are the country most dependent upon international trade simply to exist. And whether it's the Ukraine war or spat in the Persian Gulf, or the Americans going on the warpath, or simply internal political incompetence, which is now rising every day, this doesn't work, not in a non-globalized system. So China is going to flame out just as impressively as it flamed on. And we're all going to remember it for a good long time. Is that most Russian crude, about 70%, is produced in the permafrost. And because the Russian demographic is terminal, and because the Russian educational system collapsed 30 years ago, there's only a very small cadre of skilled workers that are actually trained up to do the work in the permafrost. And they're on average in their late 50s now. So there's not a lot of them. They're literally dying out. And without Western tech and above all else, Western workers, the ability of the Russians to keep this stuff flowing is very much called into question. And that's before you consider war, sanctions, or boycotts, all of which are having their own impact. So we need to plan for a not too distant future when Russian crude exports just aren't there. Now, in that scenario, especially if it happens suddenly, we're going to have a significant price shock around the world. And then you have to look to Washington. Because in Washington, the American president has the authority to end oil exports with the stroke of a pen. It doesn't have to go to Congress. That authority was already granted back in 2015. And since Biden is the most economically populist president we've ever had, there is no way he is going to expose the American consumer, the American voter, to high and volatile global prices if he doesn't have to. So the question just isn't when will the Russian stuff go offline. It's how much American stuff goes on offline with it. And if the world loses American and Russian crude at the same time, you're probably looking at crude prices never dropping below 150 again. And you're probably looking at a captured price in North America where they never rise above 70 again. Probably. There's a lot of ifs and statements linked to that prediction. Well, any sector you're going to be able to find companies that are in problems. The one I am by far the most concerned about on a global basis is America's Apple. Starting with what's going on in the tech sector, the pace of technological advance is going to slow considerably. And if Apple can no longer release a new version every 6 months, that's obviously going to hit their their bottom line. But more importantly, roughly 90% of the supply chain steps that go into the average iPhone touch the People's Republic of China in some way. Now, a lot of that is going to be more on the low value add and assembly, but that's not nothing either. And without the Chinese as part of the supply system, it's going to take Apple at least 5 years to rebuild that supply chain capacity in other parts of the world.
Hey everybody, Peter Zeihan here, coming to you from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And the story today on the 23rd of October is that yesterday, a Canadian public service union by the name of Unifor announced a strike on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And there's a bunch of things that come from this. Number one, what the Seaway is. It is a system of locks, I think 14, that connect the Western Great Lakes to the St. Lawrence Seaway itself, which goes out to the Atlantic Ocean. It is the primary artery for getting cargo from the interior of the continent, as well as from all of Ontario and Quebec out to the Atlantic Ocean. Basically, without the Seaway, you can't go upriver beyond Quebec City. And so you're talking about the bulk of the industrial base of Canada being affected by this. In addition, the Seaway is part of what allows the Erie Canal to work, which allows the New York area to access the interior of the continent as well. So as long as it's offline, what is traditionally the primary and cheapest method of moving cargo in and out of interior Canada is offline, and it complicates things for the United States as well. We're going to see a lot more stuff like this coming forward. One of the things that's going on right now in North America is that we are experiencing protracted population decline because we've had low birth rates for 40 years. Now, it's not nearly as advanced as it is in places like Northeast Asia or Europe, but it's still a factor. And in the United States specifically, in calendar year 2022, the difference between the retirees who are aging to 65 and the people coming into the workforce who are aging into 18 was just under 500,000 worker shortage just in this calendar year. And that number is going to continue to be negative for a minimum of the next 20. In fact, it's just going to go up and up and up for at least the next 11 because the people have already been born. We know exactly what the inflow into the labor market is for the next decade or two. 2 decades, yeah. Anyway, so that's kind of the first problem. The second problem is there's not a good alternative for the Canadians. Courtesy of something called the Jones Act, you really can't use the American waterway network. It prevents any cargo from being transported through the American system unless it's using a ship that is American built, owned, captained, and crewed, which by definition eliminates pretty much everything that comes from Canada. So we're going to be seeing a lot of stress in the Canadian system and a lot of stress, especially in grains. A lot of interior Canada, their only way to get to the wider world is to use the Seaway. Their only alternative is to use rail now to a place like the Quad Cities in Iowa or all the way to New Orleans, which is, technically possible, but a lot more expensive. Anyway, because of the worker shortage, we're going to be seeing activities like this over and over and over again. In the United States, we're having issues with the United Auto Workers in places like Detroit right now, where they're on strike. And the folks up in Canada are thinking they should be able to get at least as much out of their operators as the strikers are aiming for. And so, that's a 30 to a 40% wage increase to be phased in over 3 years. I'm not saying that they're not worth it. I don't know. What I am saying that is in an environment where labor is ever more scarce in North America, you should expect to see more and more and more industrial labor action at all levels. And this is just part of the environment now. So you best get used to it. And if you're an employer, you best build as positive a relationship with your workers as you possibly can, because they have become something that we're not used to thinking of workers in North America as. A scarce resource. And they're going to be priced accordingly. All right, bye.
So this is what we would call a standard demographic profile. This is Mexico. Lots of children, fewer young adults, fewer mature adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. And when you look at something like this, you're going to have a very different economic structure than what you might have for a country as opposed to Germany. So here's Germany, very heavy in the middle age, moving towards retiree. And the difference between the two here is that in Mexico, you're going to have a consumption-led system because young people do most of the spending
spending. And in Germany, you're going to have an investment-led system because when you're in your 40s and your 50s, you're saving for retirement. That simple dichotomy is kind of what drives most of what's going on in the global economy and has been driving the global economy for the last 30 years. What that means is we've been in this world where most of the developing world has been the consumption base, and most of the developed world has been the investment base. And that means the propensity for trade between the two is extreme because the poorer countries need the cash, the more advanced countries need the consumption. And so you can have things going back and forth. The Germans are good at high-end stuff, the Mexicans tend to be good at low-end stuff, and some version of this is replicated around the world. So in an environment since the end of the Cold War, when you've got global security provided by the Americans, but no real global security challenges, everybody pours money into economic development. And so from 1990 until roughly 2017, we had the greatest economic boom in human history. And I dare say for most people in the investment world, this is the world that they think is normal. It's not normal. It's the most historically atypical period we have ever known as a species. And it was always going to end, because the developing world is aging rapidly, far more rapidly than the rich world ever did. And so they're becoming Germany, but without the infrastructure, without the institutions, without the respect for democracy, without the capital structure, without the industrial base. As well, the Germans and other countries like them were aging into mass retirement. So instead of a world where we've got propensity for growth and cooperation and trade, we're moving into a world where the rich world is all retired. They're neither producing nor consuming. And the developing world is becoming aged and losing that consumption edge, but without building the capacity to move up the value-added chain. You would call this an economic dislocation, which is a very nice way to say global collapse and depression. There are a few countries that stand out as exceptions to that. The United States is at the top of the list. We have the youngest demography in the rich world. And we already have a demography that is younger than China's and will be younger than Brazil's within 20 years. So the United States is slipping into kind of this pocket reality where it builds its own stuff, trades with itself, and maybe a select group of other countries. And say what you will about the Trump administration, and there are so many things that we can say about the Trump administration. One of the things they got right is picking out specific countries that they wanted to have relationships with after this transition. So we've had 4 big successes in trade negotiations: Japan, Korea, Mexico, Canada, and we're probably going to have a 5th one with the United Kingdom this year. That's the majority of the American trade relationship. So the United States, under normal circumstances, given 3, 4, 5 years, could have transitioned from where we are right now to that sort of friends and family trading plan without suffering a recession. What the Saudis are doing is any place they see a competitor, first and foremost the Russians, where they've got a pipeline that empties out into a populated area or a pipeline that hits a port, they are sending super tankers of crude to super saturate demand in those locations, specifically going after things like Rotterdam or Suez or Korea that are popular transshipment points for Russian crude, making sure that the tanks are completely full so the Russian crude has nowhere to go. They're doing this to a slightly less intense degree wherever all their other competitors are. So, for example, slightly less intense, there's 50 million barrels of crude from Saudi Arabia coming to the American Gulf Coast to try to knock shale out. That's nothing compared to what they're doing to Europe and Asia. And the goal is just to fill up all the tanks so that the producers have nowhere to sell their crude whatsoever. So they have to shut down their pipelines and they have to shut down their wells. Now, in a place like the United States, if you do this and the wells get shut in, they can be turned back on later. And from the point that you start drilling a shale well to the day you get first crude is only about 6 weeks. So U.S. shale is going to take a hell of a hit. There's probably about 1 million barrels per day of production already offline. Probably another 2 million are going to happen before the end of the year. That's probably going to be front-loaded. No, that's a 25% reduction in shale output. That's a big deal. But it'll be back in a couple of years. But if you shut in wells in Nigeria and Siberia, they're gone. It's going to be years, if not a decade, before you see those producing again. So the Saudis are taking a long haul here, taking a big economic hit on the front side. They can afford it. Across the Gulf, Iran, say what you will about the Trump administration, he won. Iran is no longer a net oil exporter. They're going to actually be importing over the summer, which is something they have not had to do in over a century. I don't think that this is going to cause regime change. Anytime you've got 100,000 people in your elite, it takes a really big stick to move that. But this is the end of Iran having cash, which means Iran in Lebanon and in Gaza and Iraq and Syria and all the other places that the Iranians have had their fingers, all of a sudden they don't have any money to back it up. They're massively overextended, which raises the opportunity for countries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia to turn the tide in their favor. So expect a lot more nutsoid violence in this region, because the Iranians, everyone forgets, the Iranians are not the violent actors here. That's the Saudis. ISIS came from Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda came from Saudi Arabia. And we should expect to see a lot more groups like that boiling up throughout this entire region, just burning down everything that the Iranians think that they have achieved in the last 10 years. It's going to be wretchedly awful. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, those countries, the very rich countries of the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, they're involved in a global price war, primarily with the Russians, but not exclusively anymore. They are deliberately trying to drive oil prices as low as possible, negative if they can, and I think they can. And if they pull this off, I'd say even odds at present, it's going to take about 20 million barrels of crude production globally offline for years, and they will finally have what they wanted, which is a crude market where they can set the price and set the volume over the midterm. Looks broadly like they're going to be able to pull that off. The Saudis have tried something like this 3 or 4 times in the last 15 years, but the market has never been right. Now, the market's right. The emotion and the leadership are also kind of lined up. The Saudis originally went to the Russians with a deal for a preemptive cut to manage the oil market back in January and February, and the Russians said no. So the Saudis got pissed off. This wouldn't have worked without global oil demand being down by 20, 30 million barrels a day. Second, leadership. We got a new guy in charge, Mohammed bin Salman. If you've seen my readings or writings, you know that he's not my favorite person. He kind of makes Putin look like a kinder, gentler kind of gentleman, but he's young. And he's taken the institutions of Saudi Arabia by storm. He's consolidating power. And honestly, this is what a king does. And if this works for him, he will have consolidated his person as the most powerful person in the region for at least the next couple of decades. I think he's aware of that. This is his proving ground. And so far, in my opinion, it's going really well for him.
This is how we get a famine. We have been extraordinarily lucky this year. Mother Nature has been very kind. There are record harvests throughout most of the world to compensate for the loss of Ukraine. But the damage to the fertilizer system has already been done, and we will get hit with that next year. Building new phosphate systems takes a decade. We will not recover from this quickly. And by the time we have recovered from it, we will have lost a few 100 million people. Neon. You guys have all seen Star Wars, right? Yeah. I'm sorry, wrong Star Wars. Not like lightsabers but Reagan. Back at the 1983 Reykjavik summit, Gorbachev and Reagan almost got rid of nuclear weapons. And almost on his way out the door, Gorbachev said, "Oh yeah, and there's just one catch to make this all happen. You have to get rid of Star Wars." And Reagan's like, "Nope." So it kind of fell apart, and we went from there. Gorbachev went back to the Soviet Union. It was like, okay, this is the future of great power competition, space lasers that provide a missile shield. So they didn't have the technology to do the space lasers, but it was still the Soviet Union, a lot of power, so they put a lot of effort into building out the supply chain that they would need once they stole the technology. Part of that's neon. You use neon to focus the laser aperture. Soviet Union fell apart, but not before this system was built. Today, we use neon to focus the laser apertures for semiconductor fabrication facilities. Here's the problem. The steel facilities are all in southern Russia. They're losing access to global markets because of sanctions and the war. A lot of them have shut down. The second stage facilities are all in either Odessa, which hasn't had reliable electricity in 4 months, or Mariupol, where it was leveled. We've already lost 80% of global supply. which means that pretty soon we get to decide where we put our neon for purposes of making semiconductors. The other 20%, that's all in China. Now, China doesn't make the high-end microprocessors. They do the low-end. So if you want like a margarita machine that sings when the slush is at the right churn, that's a Chinese chip. You want to do something useful, that's an American chip. And since the Chinese now control all of the world's remaining supply, what do you think they're going to prioritize? Now, the technical economic term for this sort of situation is fuck. Okay, that's a taste of the problems everyone else has to deal with. Let's talk about yours. What we've got here is a map of the physical infrastructure for the energy sector in the former Soviet space. Green is oil, red is natural gas. For starters, we're going to talk about oil, specifically the ports. These are the two facilities, Primorsk in the north, Novorossiysk in the south, that are the two largest export points for Russian and former Soviet crude. Here's the problem. The southern one is in a war zone. That makes it a little sketchy in terms of insurance. Speaking of insurance, you guys get insurance more than most crowds. You cannot have a ship go in or out of any port or any congested waterway without an insurance policy. The European Union and the United States have made it impossible for Russian chartered ships to get insurance. And as of January of next year, that applies to all Russian cargoes. Which means the Russians have to self-insure their own stuff. They don't have the facilities to do that. So if one ship is hijacked, confiscated, violates an OSHA regulation, something, that's 5 million barrels a day that suddenly can't sail. And this is not Texas. This isn't even Alberta. Russian crude comes out of the permafrost. And for those of you who are from the north, not the Texans obviously, you know that in winter, as long as you're moving, you will live. But if you stop, you will freeze to death. Same thing with Russian crude in the permafrost. If the flow stops, the crude turns to gel, and the water that comes up as a byproduct freezes in the pipes. And everything from the wellhead to the pumps themselves cracks. And you have to replace the whole damn thing. The last time this happened, it was 1992, and it took the Russians 30 years to bring it all back online. They only finished last December. So we could have Latvia grab one oil tanker, and this all just stops. 5 million barrels a day. Let's talk about the Chinese. On the left, the little rainbow graphic there, that's where crude comes to the Northeast Asian space. Purple is from the Americas, yellow is from West Africa, blue is from the former Soviet space, and the big old red, that's from the Persian Gulf. On the right is where West African crude goes. Orange goes, I can't colorblind all of a sudden. Green goes primarily to the European space, and then that lower one of the yellows goes primary to Asia. What has happened because of self-sanctions in Europe is the Europeans have stopped using Russian crude wherever they can, and instead they're gobbling up most of what's available out of West Africa. They're taking stuff that used to come for us, it's not a big deal for us anymore. A lot of that is light sweet, we got plenty of that. What this has done is reordered crude flows around the world. It used to be that most consumers would use the crude that was relatively proximate. That's what the refineries were designed for. Now, everything is stretched out because the Europeans are taking stuff that used to go to China, and since the Chinese are at the very end of the world's longest supply lines, they don't have the economic or military power to project out and change that, but the Europeans do, especially when it involves their former colonies. So, are the Europeans going further for crude? Yeah. Africa's farther away than the former Soviet states. But it's nothing compared to how far the Russians need to go now. Because they're now getting an extra 1 million barrels a day from Russia. It's nothing compared to what the Chinese have to do. They're now getting an extra 1 million barrels a day from the Russians, but that crude has to come out of Novorossiysk and Primorsk, go to a supertanker raft off Portugal to do sea-to-sea transfers to supertankers, and then sail the long way around Africa and Southeast Asia. The vulnerability of that system is extreme. This is several orders of magnitude more vulnerable than the supply lines we had during World War II when people were actually shooting at these things. Again, one thing goes wrong, Latvia, this all falls apart. We might push it. Here's everybody's favorite energy minister, Ms. Granholm. She made it very clear a couple weeks ago that if American refiners and gasoline and diesel distributors do not prioritize the American market, the US government will make sure that they do. Now, in the 2015 omnibus bill, President Obama gained the power for the White House to summarily end all American oil exports with a stroke of a pen. In any environment where we have a shortage of crude because of Russian losses, especially if it's 5 million, you can expect within a matter of hours that the Biden administration is going to slam the door shut on export capacity in order to keep the American market supersaturated, in order to keep American crude prices more affordable. He, like his predecessor, is a populist. Now, what Granholm said she wanted actually was the refined product. She doesn't have the power to do that. Biden does not have the power to do that. But if you trap the crude in the American market and force it to just go to American refiners, it achieves most of what she's after. Is it a perfect fix? Of course not. And we know for sure that the Biden administration will approach a policy like this with deliberation and consultation, just like they do with everything else. Be ready. It's coming. Now that, of course, is going to trigger a bit of a crude mismatch. Here are all of the world's major crude grades. If you're at the top left, you're light sweet. If you're at the bottom right, you're heavy sour. Everything in blue, that's American shale. It's all super light. It's all super sweet. That is what's going to be trapped here. On the bottom right, you see the orange. That's Russian Urals. That's what we're going to lose. 5 million days of moderate heavy, moderate sour. Now, for those of you who are in the refining world and are having a heart attack right now, yes, middle distillates are going to be a bitch. You are the industry that is going to complain the most and the loudest, and reasonably so. And then you're going to realize that this is not a passing thing, and you simply have to retool and expand your distillation capacity for the crude you have access to it. Because you're still going to be able to import stuff if you want to, but you have to be able to deal with all this light sweet. So over the course of the next 3 years, you're probably going to increase refining capacity by 2 or 3 million barrels a day. And I know you're like, oh, that's impossible. Think about what the price differential for these crudes is going to be in this environment. Losing 5 million barrels of heavy sour, being stuck with 5 million barrels of light sweet in an international environment where the US is no longer contributing to global supplies. You're talking about a ceiling on crude prices of 50 to 80 here and a functional floor everywhere else of 150 to 200. You are going to bitch, you are going to moan, and then you are going to expand, and then you are going to laugh. It's the greatest expansion your industry will have ever seen. Could start tomorrow based on what happens in Latvia.